Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on our Monday gathering. Delighted to welcome Liam Keane, who is the chairperson of Kilkenny Voluntary Housing Association and also has been involved in politics locally in Kilkenny. But before all of that, he started out life in Kerry. Is that correct, Liam?
Yeah, I was born and reared in Kerry.
And what brought you to Kilkenny?
Well, I suppose I always wanted to be a social worker, and so my first job at the time, it's going back a long time now. At the time, really, if you were male, you wouldn't get a job in the old health boards or anything like that, because it was childcare, it was all childcare, and that was fine. So, but my kind of thing I was interested in was travellers anyway. And so the first job I got was with Kilkenny County Council, working with travellers on a temporary basis. And then I got a permanent job in Mayo, and then I left Mayo and came back when the Kilkenny job came back up. So my first boss was Tony Walsh. People know Tony Walsh.
We do indeed, yes.
So that's how it started off with travellers. And then at the time I started, homeless wasn't really an issue at all anywhere in Ireland. Or so little it didn't matter. But I suppose very early in the time, I started in Kilkenny County Council in '84. But by the late 80s, early 90s, homeless had become a problem. So I got responsibility for homelessness and travellers, and that sort of stuff, ethnic stuff, which wasn't again an issue until after 2000.
No, but both areas are areas that are extremely challenging to the public. The attitude to travellers hasn't really changed that much over the years. And the attitude to homelessness has, I think, changed. But the issue of travellers as the whole traveller community and traveller culture hasn't really changed. Is there anything that should be done to enhance the image of travellers? Or is it up to the traveller community themselves? Or is it up to the settled community?
That's a big question. I did 2 different master's theses on that question, and I wasn't the only one. Several others did as well. That's a difficult question. I think if you go back far enough in the 70s and 80s, travellers were on caravans on the side of the road. They were extremely poor people by and large, and they lived in absolute abject poverty by and large. Now there would be the exception, scrap dealers and things like that. But the average was I think back in the day in Kilkenny, we would have had maybe 20 families on the roadside who were what we call indigenous. They were always there on the roadside. But that all changed in the late 80s and 90s. We had a national task force for travel. I was a member of the task force for the traveller community. And as a result of that, we brought in a lot of legislation and initiatives, the All Ireland Traveller Health Study, the Traveller Accommodation Act. We brought in a whole load of stuff to move it on. And it moved on, certainly did move on for the vast majority of travellers. Well over 30,000 travellers in Ireland. The travellers we know are a very small minority. But I say this now, don't quote me on this, but they are very sore thumb kind of minority. They are a problem in that their behaviour is a problem. They're very hard to integrate. Like the whole thing, that whole Travellers Task Force that we worked on with Mirren Taylor, that was about what structures could we put in place to help travellers to integrate well. And one of the things was that we give county managers powers to build halting sites. It's amazing now to think that we're actually leaving halting sites, that they're obsolete really.
Yes.
But at that time, to get any of them built anywhere in Ireland. And that worked very well, and the accommodation thing worked very well. There aren't as many travellers by any means on the road. There are very, very few on roadsides or anything like that now. That part worked well. The health part, what we did was we took Australian models and models from Australia and New Zealand and this other where they trained travellers to be health workers. And we put a big investment into that, big investment in everywhere in Ireland, but in the southeast we trained, I suppose, 30 or 40 travellers to be health workers in their own communities. To change from, and this isn't a particular traveller thing, this is more, they were back in a generation that we had moved from in terms of eating fries for every meal and, a lot of grease, some habits they had, keeping an eye on their weight, that sort of thing. And again, for a lot of travellers, to some extent, that worked. And so you always think, well, if this worked, everything would be perfect. Some small amount works and it moves it on some small bit. And that worked as well. So a lot has worked. Like, we now have a senator who's a traveller. That's not a token either. She's actually a very competent woman. We have a couple of barristers. We have a lot of teachers. It's the integration has happened, but the big disappointment is that the integration in civil society isn't really any means as good. I remember the studies we were doing on it, and there was a lot of studies on the time. Like our big nut to crack was the perception of civil society about travellers. There was a question, like Micheál McGrail in Maynooth started this first, and his big questions were: would you marry a traveller? Would you live beside a traveller? Would you have a meal with a traveller? This kind of thing. Would you let your children play with travellers? And when we did studies on that later on, and we did some, I was involved in some in the early 90s, and then later again in the late 90s after the task force. That probably hadn't moved on as well as we would have liked it to, at all, really. It had moved some small bit, but not by any means to the extent that we thought. We then thought, in our innocence, and I talked to sort of the government in general now, we thought that when the whole ethnic thing changed, the traveller thing would change to the extent that, like the Irish in England, travellers were kind of part of our own, really. No, that's measuring one level of racism against another level of racism.
Yes.
But we thought that happened. I think what's happening now, more than anything else, is there's a huge population of invisible travellers around the country, and in Kilkenny indeed, because they've been housed, they're second generation housed, third generation housed. They're not visibly there on the side of the road. They're in the house, they're fine. There's a small cohort of very visible travellers who are a problem. They're a problem because of crime and because of their behaviour and things like that. We haven't cracked that, and that's a problem. I think when drugs took off in the late 80s in Ireland, early 90s, I think travellers at a higher level became, who would have been money lenders before that, and that sort of thing, which was a big thing in the traveller community. I think a lot of them became drug dealers, to be straight about it, and the travellers were in that drug dealing thing, and that messed up a lot of our plans for integration and all.
Yes.
So I hope that's a good enough answer.
Well, it's a very comprehensive answer. It's one, though, that we can't afford to say, we can't just hold up our hands and say there's nothing we can do about it. I think it behoves both parts of this divide, and it is a divide, to work together. But it has to be both ways. And there is a sense sometimes that the traveller community, they value their own culture, almost to the that they don't want to be integrated, and maybe integration isn't the right solution. It's making them bend their own culture towards our culture, and while some aspects
that's a very good point in the sense that I remember the studies we did now, that now it's 20 years ago now, and we need to do another round of studies there again, another round of interviews. But at that time, one of the things that was very striking as well was that travellers wouldn't like their children to marry settled people.
Yes.
They were very clear about it, because they regarded settled people at that time, and that's 20 years ago, they regarded settled people as having a lower standard of morality, and less faithful and loyal, and a bit less holy, and less religious. Because then there's an anomaly in the traveller thing there, for all the petty crime and all that stuff. There's quite a sense of religious, particularly the rites and the sacraments and things like that. There's a strong religious feeling there as well, which is an old Irish thing.
It is, yes. I mean, the public expression of faith is very much part of the traveller community, and it's almost, to those of us who are not part of that, see it as ostentatious. But maybe there should just be a general acceptance of the different cultures. And you say that the traveller community might see the settled community as having a lower sense of morality, but it's really just a different sense of morality, and neither is right or wrong, but they're just different.
I think where that came from was there was a very good integration of travellers in Irish society going back to, say, the start of the state, the foundation of the state. There weren't that many traveller families anyway. but they found back that because they were completely integrated into rural agriculture and they emerged. That's where they came from. They were journey people who, did all this chimney sweeping and all that sort of potato picking in particular, those kind of jobs. But then with urbanization, they got left behind. And there's a body of thought. It'd be interesting to see if we did more studies, I know, but the body of thought was that because they were so isolated in society, they didn't modernize in terms of those old values, because they would have been the values that Irish people had in the 30s and 40s. Everyone went to mass, everyone went to all the sacraments, everyone abided by all the things. They maintained them. They maintained pilgrimages, things like that. So it's just they were left outside. They didn't integrate in urban society because they ended up parking on the sides of the approach roads to big towns. And the whole move, particularly in the 90s, the whole move was to house them or give them halting sites or bring it on so they would integrate. I'm not sure. I think there is a much better level of integration. Like, I remember when we, say, before the task force thing in the early 90s, that was 93, into 92. Before that started, we had very few travellers who went to secondary school. It was practically nil. We had about 30% travellers who finished primary school. But finishing primary school for travellers was getting confirmation. That's what it was. And in order to get confirmation, you had to be there at the end, basically.
Yes.
But that all changed. And travellers were getting married at 15, 14, 15. Young traveller girls, particularly at, say, puberty, what they focused on was learning how to cook and wash and clean. That was the thing, because they were going to be married in a year's time. I think that has changed. I think there has been a mixing at a certain level between travellers and I suppose what we call the working classes in Ireland. There has been a sort of a mix there, but that's not a complete integration by a long shot.
I remember reading a report years ago in Carlow. I think it was called "Are You a Gentleman?" But the concept of teenager doesn't really exist within the traveller community. You're a child, and then you're an adult. And that's a huge, I mean, they say that within the settled community, for want of a better term, that adolescence really goes on from 12 to up to 25, that if you're missing that cultural shift or that developmental shift within the traveller community, something has to give. And it's a very difficult one for us to grasp.
It is, and there were two parts of that were quite awkward. One was there's no such thing as adolescence, so therefore you went from whenever you were married off or mixed marriage, arranged marriage, you just went straight into being an adult. But the other thing was that on the male side of that, you had a role. It was an old role of tinsmithing or horses or minding horses, things like that. When travellers urbanised, that male role was completely dissipated, was completely gone. Tinsmithing was gone, plastic replaced that. The farmers didn't need traveller men anymore to do the picking the spuds and that sort of thing. It all changed, and they got completely left outside of it. So what you had then was, and I don't mean crude about it, but what you had then was young people marrying very young, who had a lot of children, but they didn't have the skills really to handle it, and the male role was gone.
Yes.
So what you had was on the face of it, it looks like a patriarchy, but it's a really strong matriarchy. It really is, because there's no role for the men anywhere. So the whole idea in the 90s and after the task force was to drive on these. Before in the 70s and 80s, we had special kind of workshops for travellers. There was one in Carlow for years and years. And the idea behind them was that the travellers would go in there, they'd learn a skill, and they'd be able to transfer their tinsmithing skill or their horsemanship skill onto something that they could then get employment from. But the traveller culture is it's very, I don't know if for sure now, but at the time back, certainly when we were doing the studies on it, it is a very self-employment culture. It's a very big thing among travellers, self-employment. Getting travellers into wage labour it would happen, but for short periods of time until they got enough cash to buy whatever they wanted to buy. It was very difficult. I'm not sure that culture has changed hugely.
No, I'm not sure it has. The whole concept of a permanent and pensionable job just didn't exist.
No, No.
And
it didn't exist in the culture. It was never, there wasn't wage labour in the culture anyway.
Yeah.
And what you have to do is try and either, break down that culture or allow it to change. Now, one of the ways to allow it to change was that travellers would employ travellers, but that never really happened. That never really took off for us at all.
Yeah. But your own work with Kilkenny County Council in working with travellers led to working with the homeless sector. And then, obviously, that problem didn't really exist to the same extent when you were. Was it an add-on to the traveller job, or
it was an add-on? It's funny. I just get rid of something off my computer here. It was an add-on. It was an add-on in the sense that in the early sort of mid to late, like we got our first halting sets in Kilkenny in 1988, and there were small three bays each, and it was a huge thing. It was very on a very progressive manager, and it was a big thing. We didn't at the time. The homeless thing was, if somebody was homeless, they'd be sent to me. I'd find them with the various landlords, some very good landlords around town. I'd find them accommodation, and we'd sort it. We'd fix it. What homeless happened more than anything else then was, and we had our sort of, I suppose, we had local people who were men who were alcoholics, who were kind of like continually homeless. And in fairness to the Good Shepherd brothers, and all that, which we know a lot about.
Yes.
Back in the early 80s, the then Loreto convent was sold because Loreto moved to their new school, and the Good Shepherd brothers came from America and moved in and at the invitation of Bishop Birch, and provided a service for homeless. And they actually provided a service for people who were homeless and young people with disabilities, which is kind of forgotten about now. But Brother Thomas Byrne on the second floor, I remember being at, I came to Kilkenny in 1884, and at the time it was one big old building with nothing in it other than a small number of very alcoholic older homeless men, and on the second floor maybe 20 young boys and girls with disabilities that Brother Thomas just minded and fed and kept going with them.
Yep.
He was an extraordinary man.
Wasn't he just? It's fitting that one of the sections in the Good Shepherd Centre complex is named after him, Brother Thomas Place. And I think it'll be a lasting testimony to his humanity and Christianity. It was. But your involvement with the homeless section expanded through when you left Kilkenny County Council and the HSE to work in the political front, where you were advising people on the homelessness issue. Can you tell us a little bit about how that evolved?
I suppose just very quickly, at the end of 2003, I left Kilkenny County Council and I joined the HSE. Now, the reason for that really was I had been a member of the Travellers Task Force, and I chaired, by default, I ended up chairing a few of them because no one else would, but I chaired the health one, and each health board was obliged to have a sort of a general manager or a specialist manager for travellers, and South East hadn't, so I was invited to go on to that because I had been originally in it and all that. So I joined that. When I joined it, it was interesting really. The HSE's role in homelessness is very much about the health care of the homeless person. They're not interested in the roof, as we know, to our cost. But at that time, for various reasons at the time, I ended up getting homelessness and drugs in the HSE. Anything that was social inclusion, I was the Southeastern Health Board's regional man for it. That quickly, I joined them in 2004. By 2006, the Southeastern Health Board were gone, the HSE were there, and through a process of sort of a series of very rapid lead for HSE South, which would be the Southeast and Cork and Kerry for social inclusion. And then I was a national planner then for a specific one of the social inclusion, and one of them was homelessness. Actually, the way it worked out, I started with homeless and travellers, and then I was given addiction. My last planning, after about a year, I was moved on to national planning for addiction. But that's the homeless piece. Sorry, just to get on.
Yes.
So we were advising at that stage. We were advising the HSE, and at that level we were very much advising government. You would have a specific minister that would deal with homeless or social inclusion, really, homeless and addiction things. So we'd from within the HSC, we'd be sitting down with kitchen cabinet stuff. We'd be sitting down advising them on how, what we needed to roll out. One of our problems with the homeless thing, among many, it has changed substantially since then. One of our problems at that time was that we had people who graduated from being in childcare facilities or families who the HSE had social workers visiting. They graduated from that just straight into homelessness. So we had 16, 17-year-olds at hostels, coming into hostels, which wasn't a good place for them. And what we were trying to do was turn the homeless hostels that time were big, old dormitory institutions. The Good Shepherd being one of them. The Good Shepherd had 47 beds, and no, Good Shepherd was the ones. We had some horrendous ones. So our job there then, and in fairness, when I joined the HSE, I must say Kilkenny County Council in particular now, and Waterford City Council, they were very progressive. They sat down and the first thing we looked for was a full review of the homeless services of the South East. And then we brought in a couple of new principles, new systems, because we had a national working group working on this. And one of the things I was delighted to bring in, and we launched it in the New Park Hotel, was the PAP idea, the idea of an interagency frontline team that would have the local authority social worker, psychiatric nurse, at that time a community welfare officer, but they're gone now, and the manager of the hospital, that they would work as a team. They'd meet every week, say once or twice a week. They'd go through every whole single case, and then we'd have a care and case management approach for every homeless person. And that we launched that, and we brought it in, and it actually works quite well. I think that was a long time ago, but I think it works well, because what we wanted to do was to have every single person in homeless, and at that time we had about 2,000 people in homeless. I mean, it's sad to think what we have now. We wanted every one of the 2,000 of them to have their own plan, and then somebody who was managing that plan with them and the various stages of it. So that was the idea behind that. That worked reasonably well enough. What happened later, and just I suppose you were alluding to my work with Phil Hogan and John Paul Keane and Peter. What happened later was when Phil became Minister for environment and housing and all that. We were identifying with Cathal Morgan. You'd hear of Cathal now. He's now the lead for disabilities with the HSE. But at that time, he was the Homeless Agency CEO. And we identified with Cathal that there was a bad problem in Dublin. There was a bad growing problem in Dublin. Our job then would have been Cathal's job and his agent group were to try and work out solutions, how we'd work it, and we did a review of that, and we had ideas, we'd floating around. We were at that stage, at the very early stage, we were talking about buying a hotel or two, because at that time the crash had happened. NAMA had properties everywhere. We had all sorts of things we could do with those properties, and we felt that if we do that, we'd take the heat out of Dublin, and we'd have a holding hotel for them, and then they could move on to accommodation as we sourced it. But the whole market shrunk and collapsed, and what happened is it drove homeless mad. The first place was in Dublin, and we at one stage in Dublin, I remember the row we had was with Dublin City Council about how much would it cost for us to fix this. And you would laugh, this like we were talking about, well, we could inject 5 million anywhere into it immediately. Now that's peanuts now in comparison to the homeless thing. I think what happened more than anything else is that the people were becoming homeless, families in particular were becoming homeless. And I know that within that, this is not a nice thing to say, but within that there were all sorts of abuses of the system. There were people who were becoming homeless in order to get houses. There were people who were claiming to be homeless but wouldn't live now. But they only amounted to, in any event, somewhere around 10% of the problem. The real problem was a complete shrinkage and collapse in private rented accommodation in particular, and an over-reliance on our part on the private rented market because of the crash.
Yes.
And we then couldn't, because of our deal with the IMF, we couldn't build local authority houses. We literally didn't have the money to do it. So we aggravated it because the safety valve at the time would have been to build a lot of units and try and pull, and there would have been an 18-month to 2-year time lapse, but we would have pulled a lot of people out of homelessness. That didn't work. And what has happened since is we have this it's clogged, and that's why I'm really pleased. I'm not, as Ian and myself, I'm bragging here when we said this, but we were really pleased about the Good Shepherd in Kilkenny, because we really got into. Damien English was when Phil was gone. Alan Kelly was minister, and his homeless policy was AK-47 kind of stuff. Fell out with all the agencies. We didn't really achieve an awful lot. Now, we didn't lose a lot of ground, but then Simon Coveney came on as at one stage that we had a minister every year, different minister for housing every year. Simon Coveney came on. He was much more measured, but the problem was at the stage that he came on, what we needed to do to address it was becoming bigger and bigger scale and bigger scale. And what was happening was, people might agree with it, but what happened was local authorities and the HSE, but particular authorities, they weren't seeing it in the big scale that was needed at that stage, because it had become a big problem, and not just in Dublin. So I suppose just to say about Kilkenny, and we know this very well, but what happened in Kilkenny was we in the Good Shepherd, we began to realise, the extent of the scale in Kilkenny. At one stage we had 4 women sleeping rough under bridges and in derelicts and things like that. We had, and the Good Shepherd is an excellent organisation who took in everyone they possibly could. We were over capacity for ages and ages, and got a tenner off from our statutory funders for it, but there was nothing we could do. So what we had to do as a little cameo of the thing nationally, where it actually worked, where the solution worked, or worked to a very great extent, was we changed as a voluntary body to being not just for homeless men, not just a hospital for home. We changed in that time, Ian, you remember in 2017, yes. We changed our philosophy completely. Noel Sherry came in, and Noel came in from Focus Island with that philosophy. He had been in the Dublin battleground, and he brought that thinking to us, and the board, we fully agree with it and we fully supported it. So we had a rapid change, and what we did was we went from being the hostel or the facility or the centre that was grand for the homeless men of 10 years before, to being a solution to the problem for families, for women, homeless women, for homeless men, for couples, children, the whole thing. So we had to jump that quickly. And the other thing was the scale of the service we were providing went from, I think we had 9 or 10 houses in 2017 before we changed what we were doing. We have 160 now with 80 more in the pipeline. So that's the kind of scale that was needed. And at the time, politically, we brought Owen Murphy down, we brought Damien English. Owen Murphy was the next minister after Simon. We brought him down, we brought Damien English down, we'll be bringing Darragh O'Brien down if we can ever get out of this lockdown thing. But what we've been kind of screaming at them was, if you take the likes of the Good Shepherd Centre, if you take them in counties like Kildare, Wicklow, Louth, Waterford, any counties that surround the big urban areas, and you grow them the way that Kilkenny was, the Good Shepherd was, you have a reasonable chance of a large scale sort of intervention. As this thing from some local authorities, Kilkenny is very good, and I wouldn't be criticising, but some other local authorities not that far away from us are still operating on like 3 or 4 houses a year, that kind of thing. That's not going to solve the scale of the problem we have by a long shot. And that problem is getting worse. Now, the moratorium on evictions and all that is going to freeze it for a period of time, but it's still there and it's still a problem. So I don't know if that's okay. I'm going on and on.
But this is the critical part, that the evictions are held in stasis for the moment, but it's like a pressure cooker. When that moratorium is lifted, it's going to result in a very rapid problem very quickly, unless a solution is found. And that has led to the establishment of this new body, Kilkenny Voluntary Housing Association. And why was that set up as apart from the Good Shepherd Centre?
Well, you see, one of the difficulties for the Good Shepherd Centre at the time when we responded to the homeless problem, one of the problems for us was that our identity, I would say, I hope I'm right now, but our perception is that we are well received in Kilkenny and we're well known as a homeless service. I think people now, know that we provide more than a homeless service, more than just for homeless men. The difficulty was we were getting so big. We were in local government speak, in housing speak. We went from a tier 1 organisation, which was a small organisation with a specific purpose, with a small number of houses. Like tier 1s would be homeless hostels or homeless centres, elderly facilities, that kind of thing. We jumped from tier 1 to the top of tier 2, which would be a sizable voluntary housing body. And now we're going to enter into tier 3 very soon. At 300 units, we'll enter into tier 3, and we're at 240 something and growing. So as a result of that, we had a couple of things to look at. One was the Good Shepherd ran the risk of losing its identity and its purpose, and it actually isn't in our gift to take that purpose away from the Good Shepherd. That was set up before us. We are only custodians of it as the board of management. That was the first thing, and that would be diluted, because right now, even as speaking, the Kilkenny Voluntary Housing Body, as our association, has one meeting yet, and we'll develop, and that's because of COVID-19. We lost a year because of COVID-19, but we'll be growing and growing. But like at the moment, if we acquire properties anywhere in the county, it's the Good Shepherd Centre is seen as acquiring them. It's seen as a homeless thing immediately. We've had this in Callan, we've had Homer, Callan. We've generally ended up in the board Canala, because what happens is that local people feel that we're landing homeless people from Kilkenny City or from somewhere else on them. But what we're actually doing is we're building and acquiring houses to take people off those housing lists who badly need to be accommodated. That's actually what we're doing. So the danger was that the Good Shepherd's, homeless work, and it's a service-driven homeless service. It's more about helping the clients and the case plans with them, the integrated approach to helping them, because our clients in homeless are very complex drug problems, many of them, most of them. So it's more about protecting that work and leaving the Good Shepherd get on that work, which is critical work, maybe in smaller scale, but much, much more critical and much more acute work. So the Kilkenny Voluntary Housing Association will become like Respond or Clúid or any of those. It'll be a landlord, a benevolent social landlord who will acquire and build aggressively until we eat into the sort of worst cases that are on the houses. We have 860 people on the Kilkenny housing list. No, not all of them need housing immediately or anything like that. But 400 or 500 extra units wouldn't even really impact. It's even at a high level that we need to go. So that I hope that explains it. The Kilkenny Voluntary Housing Association will really be, a voluntary housing body that provides accommodation for people who need it off the housing list.
Yeah, and one of the things that it has done is virtually eliminate the need for families to stay in hotels in Kilkenny when they become homeless suddenly. And this, I think, is the image where things have changed so much in the last couple of years, is that you're seeing homeless families, not just homeless men or homeless people, homeless individuals, and where families are involved. I mean, there's a constitutional requirement for where the family is paramount, and for the state not to support families would seem to be a derogation of its responsibilities. And the establishment of a social housing facility, I think, is something that other counties could emulate. Are there any other examples throughout the country of where this has been as successful as it appears to have been in Kilkenny?
Yeah, not really. And I don't like saying that. I think the thing that broke our hearts really was that, given the goodwill that we have and the work we try to do and all that sort of thing, that we saw children coming out of hotel rooms, going to school and going back to hotel rooms. It was extraordinary to think that at this time in a progressive country like ours, and we had sorted our desperate financial problems with the IMF and all that this was happening, particularly when on the scale of things that's not a huge number. I know 10,000 people in homeless services is a lot, and then some of them that figure includes ones like that would be in Good Shepherd houses and all that sort of thing. But it did break our hearts, because it was like there's something awful inhuman about that, particularly for children. And it wasn't wasn't that again for us, for all of us, was it wasn't a failing in the person or an addiction or it wasn't. We have people who end up in a mess because they have problems in their lives and pathological problems in their lives, and we have to try and fix them because it's addiction or whatever it is. This wasn't that. This was people who had nowhere to go, literally nowhere to go. And to answer your question, Ian, I think what really and my Kilkenny County Council is what really was a humiliation for us and for Kilkenny County Council was that we had people in hotels in Kilkenny. There's a real kind of pride around that. We don't let things like that happen, basically, and that, I suppose, more than anything else, that crisis for the reaction in us all that drove us to do this. Disappointing thing is where you see bits that elsewhere in other counties. It's happening in Dublin because it has to happen in Dublin because the scale is so great, the pressure is so great. But by and large, there has been a poor buying around the country. Old habits that some local authorities had where the homeless in their county, because they wouldn't be doing very much, would go to the next county where they were doing a lot. Some of that goes on. There hasn't, I suppose, if you could change things, if we could sit down with Darragh O'Brien, we'd say, if we could get the Good Shepherd model, and this isn't about the Good Shepherd and how great we are or bad we are or whatever, if you could get that model and drive that model, and you need two things really. You need the organisation to have the courage and madness, perhaps, indeed, to take it on, because there is a lot of risk and a lot of risk everywhere. And it takes, and I just said this, and just praising Ian and Noel, it takes an awful lot of work to run all the fundraisers you need to run in order to go from getting 10 grand a year to getting 200 grand a year, to consolidate the organisation, to be able to have enough reserves and strength to buy that many houses. And it takes an awful lot of work. But on the other hand, if we don't do it, and it's not happening elsewhere. I know I have lately now that the Vincent de Paul hospitals are being handed over to Paul by the Vincent de Paul. That's not that progressive. Like I'd love to see there is that the county managers in those counties, and the county manager in Kilkenny was very supportive of the Good Shepherd and is that they would sit down with those organisations and say, okay, this is the problem and this is the solution we need, and we're here. So we need to sit down and figure out how big we have to go and what we have to do to get there to solve the problem. And that's what happened in Kilkenny. And we fought with each other and disagreed on things and all that kind of thing. But that is not happening here. And I suppose one advantage for us in Kilkenny as a result of that is that housing in the Minister's office love us and are very good to us, and they're very helpful and supportive and all that. But we haven't been able politically to transfer that kind of think tank to other places well enough. I suppose, just to answer your question, some small examples. Waterford is bad now, in fairness, but some, elsewhere it's not good.
Honest. And it perhaps behoves us in Kilkenny to use the good example that has, and use the positive stories and get those stories out there. It's stories that will change people's minds rather than policies, although it's the policies that create the stories in many ways. So maybe publicity, by us even talking about the issue, will generate a more positive attitude. One thing, just want to ask you, Liam, the Good Shepherd Centre, as you mentioned, has always been successful in any of the fundraising events, even during COVID. Will Kilkenny Voluntary Housing Association be endeavouring to raise funds from the public?
That's a very good question. I suppose to answer that, one of the things that has happened as a result of the Good Shepherd, and I'd like to take the chance here, and I always like to say that one of the reasons we were successful, the most central reason that we were successful with the Good Shepherd in moving from where we are to where we were to where we are now, is a huge support we got in Kilkenny. We ran a few fundraisers in St. Canice's Cathedral. They brought in phenomenal exposure and monies, and not just the money on the night. Though they were worth about €10,000 a night to us, but the extra money they brought in from people who came to us after and said, I want to make a donation, and it's reasonably sizable monies.
Yes.
what I was saying, and it's because the people in the Good Shepherd and the people in Kilkenny have a pride about Kilkenny. We have a pride about not having our people homeless and not having and there was a strength behind us in that. It was a huge at a time when Ian, we met with obstacles in the statutory services, a lot of obstacles at that time. That support from the people of Kilkenny was a huge drive, because it was telling us, you're doing the right thing, we're going to back you. And that, for me anyway, that gave us the confidence to keep going when, we wondered, would we make enough money to be able to do the thing?
Yes.
But the difficulty for us with the Kilkenny Voluntary Housing Association is we would then have another organisation taking the donations that should go to the first one. But the solution to that is, for any organisation, when you start and you grow, you have to consolidate. You can't depend on donations every year to just run your show. And off on the basis that we needed donations to break even, to just provide the service. Then we got to a stage, as was required on us by the charity level, where we actually were putting reserves in place and building reserves and having maintenance plans and all goes with that. I think the fact that we have now got about 160 tenants who are paying us rent, and we're going to have a lot more. We'll have well over 300 tenants who are paying us rent. That's a solid, consolidated base that will be enough to fund the Kilkenny Voluntary Housing Association anyway, and the Good Shepherd. And remember, between both of those organisations, we're carrying a shared staff. The staffing is completely shared.
Yes.
So the overhead cost for both organisations is just one. It's the cost of one organisation with a little bit extra.
Yes.
So we feel we should have enough in the Kilkenny Voluntary Housing Association to keep going to enough revenue. And by and large, for the Good Shepherd, much of the fundraising we'll be doing in the future for the Good Shepherd, I suspect, will be for individual projects that we won't get funded for anywhere else.
Yeah.
And for profile and for just to keep that relationship with the public that we have, which is really, really good.
Yeah, and it has to be maintained by the telling of stories, as I say. And one of the creative things that was done recently were people telling those stories on and them being circulated on Facebook. And they've generated a lot of positive comments. One of the things that struck me, though, is that in the Voluntary Housing Association, that the people who are paying rents, there's a very high proportion of those people that are virtually no rent arrears. That people are grateful enough to get the houses and they pay their rent, which obviously sustains the organisation and helps the organisation to develop.
Yeah, definitely. And from my days in the HSE and with the love with Kilkenny County Council, our national thing on homelessness was if we got 70% of the rent in from homeless families, you would have a break-even situation. And what we would do is nationally, when we'd allocate funding to you based on that you would have it's your responsibility for 70% of the rent. Now and for elderly services, it'd be 95% of the rent. What the Good Shepherd at the moment is at extraordinary thing really in COVID, and that's again, our tenants are so good, to be fair, is that we're at about 99%, 98.5%, 99%, in and around that.
Well, that's a major testimony, not just to the organisation, but to the tenants themselves. And it just shows that these were people.
I think what's happened. I think when people get into a homeless problem, and remember the scale is huge now. A lot of people now there's an awful panic. It's an awful thing to be homeless, or to have homelessness hanging over. And we know families who come to us, and we've people who've come to us who are homeless, who are working, but they still can't get accommodation. And it's an awful. It's like almost a prison sentence on them. It's so.
Yes. And
I find particularly they get very upset. They get panicky and upset, and it's and in fairness to Noel, we've had some dramatic cases where we had to move and try and solve it quickly for people because it was so dead. Like they had 3 or 4 children that were going to be homeless. They had literally nowhere to go. The Aspect Hotel. It was at the Aspect Hotel, which really brings back everyone everyone regresses in those situations. So when they get the tenancy, they experience, by and large, when they get the tenancy, there's great issue with that. We have one or two tenants who would be well-known, traditional homeless, mainly men, younger guys who are problematic. They're from Kilkenny, everyone knows them, they're problematic no matter where they were. But the vast majority of our tenants are very good tenants. They're glad to get the chance, to be fair. And they're fine. They're good tenants. We're proud of them.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way to draw this to a conclusion. I'd just like to ask if anybody else who's listening in would like to ask Liam any questions. If there's anyone there. I think we've probably covered most of the things that we...
Ian.
Yes? Hi, John.
Hi, Ian. John Grace here. Ian, just to say thanks very much. There's hugely involved, a mighty amount of information, and it's great to know what's going on, and certainly the work that you're doing there is phenomenal, and certainly as people living in Kilkenny, we can be very proud of what's been achieved. I just think it's phenomenal, and just well done. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Yeah. Well, listen, I'd like to thank you, Liam, for giving the time to us today and to let people know just what's going on in spite of all the restrictions that are laid upon us by COVID. I know that we have a meeting this evening in the Good Shepherd Centre, which is going to be conducted the same as this by Zoom. I'm not sure when we're going to emerge from the need to rely on Zoom, but I'd like to thank you for giving us the time, and to thank you also for all the work that you're doing.
Thanks.
I have to outline that this work is done in a voluntary capacity, and that's Kilkenny Voluntary Housing Association. Isn't the word voluntary is a key part of that, and nobody who's on the board is paid from there for the work that they're doing. But it's led very ably by Liam and by Noel Sherry, who's the chief executive. Anyway, thank you very much, Liam, and I'll probably be seeing you later this evening.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Ian.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The other thing that I'll be doing is I'll be circulating a newsletter today about all the work that we're doing in Rotary. Rotary is still continuing in spite of the restrictions of COVID, and there's an awful lot still happening. The Aid to the Lebanon project generated a very positive response, and we had hoped that today it would all be collected by the army coming from Finner Camp in Donegal. But Donegal hit level 4 before the rest of the country, and people are restricted from moving out. And I'm not sure where that leaves us if the rest of the country moves into level 4. Do you know, Jason, what will happen if the army in Kilkenny can't step in, or will they be able to move from Kilkenny to bring the collected items to the Lebanon?
So what they're going to do, Ian, to try and minimise it, is to get the local barracks, depending on where the Rotary clubs are around the country. So Kilkenny will look after Kilkenny and Tipperary type of thing. Cork will look after Cork and Kerry, and various plants like that.
Yeah.
So we'll know soon this week.
Great. No, but I'm sure you were very heartened by the response, not just from Kilkenny, but nationally. It was a very positive response to an urgent situation.
I know it's been fantastic, and keep an eye on Rotary Ireland Facebook page over the next couple of days, where we'll be pushing out all of the various photographs. But there's been a response from 31 out of 72 clubs across the country, and an amount of monetary donations made, but equally a number of clubs have gone out there and raised donations of medical aid and literacy aid from their communities. Some phenomenal achievements. The Rotary Club of Monaghan, President Diane Hendrick up there, spoke to a contact in the Football Association of Ireland, the FAI, on the back of the request for sports equipment. So the FAI summer soccer camps were actually cancelled this season. So she's managed to get 200 footballs and 200 individual kits for kids from Contact up there. So just brilliant stuff like that happening up and down the country. I'm sure we're going to fill a container now at this stage at 10 to 11 on, which is brilliant.
Great. That's really positive. Footballs take up a lot of space, but I think the more things that we can garner, the better. And hopefully we'll be able to get the material that's been collected locally away as soon as possible. So anyway, I'll be circulating a newsletter later today, and hopefully keep people who are not joining us by Zoom informed of what's happening. Thank you very much. And we don't meet next week. It's the bank holiday, but hopefully we will meet again on Monday, the 2nd of November. Okay. Thank you all.
Well done, Ian.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Great. Thanks. Take care. Bye now.